Chapter 4: The Transformation of Land into Property. 1. The emergence of the mark system in Germanic tribes. The mark system. This is where we see land transform from common wilderness into regulated asset, a bridge between absolute communism and absolute private property. The mark was a village community that collectively possessed a defined territory, forests, pastures, arable lands. In the original mark system, individuals owned nothing, not a single inch of soil. The land was divided into 3 categories. First, the common, forests and wastes, entirely open to all members for woodcutting and foraging. Second, the pasture, where the cattle of the entire village grazed together. Third, the arable land, the most significant for the future of property. The community as a whole was the ultimate owner, but this land was divided into lots, distributed among individual households for cultivation. But here's the key: the lots were not permanent. To ensure no family gained unfair advantage by holding the most fertile soil, the plots faced periodical repartition, by lot. Every few years, families surrendered their plots back to the community, received new ones. This prevented land from becoming theirs in a hereditary sense. The Germani understood something. Private ownership of land would lead to decay of military spirit and the rise of social classes. The mark was a living organism of collective responsibility. The community decided when to sow, when to reap, how to manage water. Even a family's house lot, though more permanent, remained under the mark's jurisdiction. This system proves something crucial. For centuries, European society functioned perfectly without private landed titles. The mark was the last great stand of communal property, before population growth, warfare, and rising nobility shattered the ancient bonds of the soil. 2. Periodical repartition of soil in primitive communities. The most significant barrier to private landed property: periodical repartition. For millennia, human societies operated under a principle. A family might have right to the harvest of a field, but no permanent right to the field itself. From the Russian steppes to Indian villages to the Germanic forests, the soil was a common fund, redistributed to maintain social equality. This was a sophisticated response to the threat of inequality. Communities understood the danger. If one family held the most fertile plot forever, they'd inevitably become wealthier, more powerful than their neighbors. The tribal gens would be destroyed. To prevent this, the mark or village council met at fixed intervals, sometimes yearly, sometimes 3, 9, or 15 years. They threw lots for available arable land. When the dice fell, every household surrendered its current plot, moved to a new one. The luck of good soil rotated among all members. This repartition was the ultimate expression of communal sovereignty, proof that the state of indivision was natural law. In the Russian Mir, the village commune, this practice survived well into the 19th century. Land wasn't a commodity to be bought or sold. It was a living trust managed for the benefit of the living and the unborn. This constant movement of ownership meant land couldn't be alienated, couldn't be used as collateral from debts, couldn't be sold to an outsider, because no individual had permanent title to sell. The repartition reflected a different psychological relationship with nature. Earth was seen as a mother who provides, not as real estate to be conquered. But as agriculture became more intensive, requiring long-term investments like irrigation or deep plowing, this system faced pressure. Families started demanding longer possession to reap the rewards of their specific labor. This friction between temporary lot and permanent labor became the crack that allowed private property to shatter the communal world. 3. Agricultural conquest and forest clearing. The definitive shift from temporary use to claim of possession was forged through physical struggle. Agricultural conquest. In the early Mark and Mir, much of the earth was covered by vast ancient forests, the wastes, territories that belonged to the community but remained unproductive. The turning point came when individuals, specific family units, began the arduous task of asarting, forest clearing. When a man spends months felling trees, burning undergrowth, removing stones to make soil fertile, he's doing more than using land. He's incorporating his labor into it. This labor investment gave rise to a new idea. The person who transformed wild into field had a special, more permanent right, more than someone who'd done nothing. In many early legal codes, a new rule emerged. The land belongs to the clearer of the wood, the first exception to communal repartition. Agricultural conquest was the primary engine dissolving the mark system. Ancient, already cleared lands might still face periodical redistribution, but the new lands, the novalia, often exempt. Families argued it would be unjust to surrender a field they'd created through their own exhaustion back to a neighbor who hadn't shared the burden. The forest began to shrink. In its place appeared a patchwork of fields, no longer held in common, instead tied to specific lineages. This process introduced improvement as legal title. The more a family improved their plot, stone walls, irrigation ditches, permanent barns, the harder for the community to reclaim it. The labor of the past began dictating ownership of the future. This was the beginning, the individual family asserting itself as economic power against the gens. Forest clearing was the first true fencing of the world, where sweat of the brow became the ink that wrote the first private deeds. 4. The villa system versus the communal mark. One of the most significant confrontations in the history of land ownership. On one side, the Roman villa, absolute, centralized, individual ownership. A single master, pater familias, held total dominion over vast estates, often worked by slaves or colony. On the other, the mark, decentralized, democratic, communal village organization, where land was shared heritage of the gens. As the Roman Empire expanded and eventually decayed, these two systems bled into one another. The Roman villa was precursor to the feudal manor. It introduced the latifundium, large tracts of land owned by the few, where workers had no claim to the soil they tilled. The mark was built on equal shares and periodical repartition. For the Germanic tribesmen, the idea of one man owning an entire valley while others worked as subjects, alien, an affront to the laws of kinsmen. The eventual victory of the villa-type system over the mark wasn't sudden. It was a slow erosion of communal rights. As Germanic chiefs adopted Roman titles and legal concepts, they started viewing communal markland as their own private villa. The common, forests and pastures was gradually enclosed. Free members of the mark were slowly transformed into tenants or serfs. The democratic council of the village was replaced by the singular will of the lord. This defines the transition into the Middle Ages. The villa brought efficiency of centralized management, rigidity of private titles, but it destroyed ancient equality of communal tribes. The mark left behind a legacy of shared governance, common rights that would persist in collective memory of the peasantry for centuries, often sparking rebellions against encroachment of landed nobility. The confrontation between these systems was the birth pangs of feudalism, where the land of the people finally became the land of the Lord. 5. The move from collective use to individual possession. The final erosion of the ancient communal world wasn't a single event. It was a fundamental shift in the human psyche, from seeing land as something to be used to seeing it as something to be possessed. In earlier stages of Mark and Mir, the community provided individuals with usufruct, a right to the fruits of the soil. But as agriculture became more intensive, as the Roman concept of dominium, absolute ownership, seeped into Germanic and Slavonic codes, the temporary lot solidified into permanent estate. Several factors accelerated this move toward individual possession. First, the rise of the specialized family. As the broad gens broke into smaller paternal households, these units demanded their own separate shares not subject to the whims of village lottery. Second, the development of exchange and commerce. You can't sell a plot of land that's going to be taken away in 3 years. The market demanded fixity of tenure. Periodical repartition was seen as an obstacle to progress. Slowly, repartitions grew further apart until they ceased altogether. This move also had a religious and ancestral dimension. Families began burying their dead in specific plots, establishing sacred hearths tied to particular ground. Land was no longer just a source of food, it became the pedestal of the family. Once the right of inheritance was established, the transition was complete. The community lost its power to reclaim the soil. The common was carved into private property. This marks the end of the first great epoch of human history. The primeval state of commonality was now a memory, replaced by a world of boundaries, titles, exclusion. By the end of this stage, the individual stood alone on his plot of land, no longer as a member of a group sharing a gift of nature, but as an owner defending a legal right. The age of the individual had begun, and with it, the age of the state to protect that individual's claims.